All right, there we go. So welcome to Module 3, Session 3 of Special Education 101 for Administrators. As a reminder, this is a safe space. So this is the place where I want you to feel comfortable to ask questions. Um, we're not going to, judge you for your questions because if you have the question, chances are somebody else has that question. So please ask questions as they come up. Again, this is informal, so you don't always have to raise your hand, right? Unless it gets too chatty, in which case we'll have to set some parameters. But generally speaking, you can just interrupt. Thanks for having your cameras on. Unless you're driving, please do not have your cameras on. If you're driving, just focus on driving. You can just listen. It's okay. You don't have to take notes. This is recorded. Of course, staying on task and being accountable as learners. So I know this says you have to you ask questions to the chat, just interrupt us. So we're going to talk a little bit about considerations with disciplining students with disabilities, and then we're going to have our behavior panel with all of the questions that you guys asked. In the module, you'll notice that all the resources that we're going to mention are basically in the module. In our SPED 101 links, that document, I'm going to just copy it again and stick it in the chat. That I just put the link to the behavior topic page on the ITC because what I really want you to do is get used to going to the Idaho Training Clearinghouse, the ITC, going to that behavior page and finding the resources yourself. If we just always give you links, then you won't know how to find them when you can't find the Google Doc where the links are. So I really want you to get used to using that page and figuring out how to navigate it. But again, always ask if you have questions. And if you can't find something, please let us know. Sometimes it's tricky. I have a gardener, a very noisy gardening situation going outside my office. Can you guys hear the chainsaws on the record? Okay, good. So discipline and students in special education, if you haven't already noticed, there's a couple different things that we have to take into consideration when we're looking at discipline and students in special education. So one thing that is really, really important to remember is that IDEA requirements supersede district policy when considering discipline for students in special education. What does that mean to you? Any examples of that in real life practice?
Well, I think for anybody who's been a principal, you have certain professionals who they desire, especially with behaviors, um, they desire certain actions. And I've been so before I was a principal, I was a behavior specialist and worked in a day treatment program and tried to remind the team that yeah, I know that's what you'd like to do, but IDEA says we have to do this instead. And having those, they just sometimes teachers and administrators do not understand that, but that is federal law.
Yep. At the end of the day, you're receiving federal funds, right? And we're following IDEA, and that supersedes. Another thing to keep in mind is we'll say um, sometimes people think that if, let's say, that's against school policy to use a cell phone, for example. If the IEP team determines that that student needs a cell phone to make progress and participate in their general education curriculum, et cetera, they should have a cell phone, right? And so that's going to supersede in that case as well. And so sometimes it's hard for, I think, especially some of our charter schools that are kind of like considered to be classical charter schools. That can be a really hard conversation to have with administration. And so just keeping in mind that we have to look at what the IEP team determines and look at IDEA. Is there anything you wanted to add
Yeah.
to that, Steph?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that a lot of times I appreciate that you hit on that point, Vanessa. I think that there are some districts, LEAs, that try to really go through this process through their boards and they develop policies and they implement them through their boards and they think that that means that they don't have to do all of these things. If we implement a policy that says we have zero tolerance related to, violent behavior from students and it's immediate expulsion, like that, you could write all of those things on paper. That's sure. Those are words on paper, but you are not going to be able to implement that policy legally because it is contrary to IDEA. So even if you were to jump through all of the hoops and go through all of the processes to adopt the policies and implement them through your boards, it's not allowed, right? Like we have to look at what the IDEA requirements are, like Dave said, and marry those things together, right? We have to take all of that into consideration. And so it's really powerful information for you as administrators when you're talking with your boards, when you're talking with your other team members to, bring that to light for them.
Yep, absolutely. So it's really important as administrators to know your role, right? To know what the student status is and to know what protections they have under IDEA. Always making sure that your responsibility is to ensure that the student receives free and appropriate public education, that we are thinking about equitable and compliant decision making. We're being collaborative with our teams. And we're familiar with the manifestation determination review process and all of the documentation that needs to take place. So there is this discipline flow chart that was in the modules. It's also available on the Idaho Training Clearinghouse. In a little bit, I'll make sure that I just said I wasn't going to give you straight links, but sometimes it's just so much easier. I'll give you the
I'll put it
link,
in the
don't
chat.
worry. Okay, thanks. But also, please take the time to get used to using the Idaho Training Clearinghouse, especially that behavior topic page. It's wonderful. Does anybody have any questions about the module, what you read in the module, the discipline flow chart, anything like that before we keep going? You guys are quiet this morning. Okay. I'm not going to go into great detail with this because it's something you can take a look at on your own, but I do want you to make sure that you're familiar with it, you know how to find it, and that whenever there's a question that you refer back to these guidance documents. Rebecca says anytime she has a question, she goes to CESA and the Idaho Department of Education. Good job, Rebecca. Yeah, when you're not sure, reach out. We're here to help. Okay, so things we need to think about is when we're just doing a short classroom removal, and the student continues to have access to educational opportunities with peers in gen ed and receive special education services, that is typically not resulting in a change of placement, right? Now, if the student is pulled out and let's say they're in the office, they for a period, like let's say for math, every single day, they get pulled out for a math class because they blow out in math for whatever reason. Maybe they're struggling with math, but they don't want to ask for help. And still a short period of time. We have to consider that pattern of removals, right? Because that student is demonstrating that every single day there's an issue in math, they're being pulled out, and we have an issue. So even though that's a short period of time, that can be considered a pattern of removals, right? They're not participating with their peers, they're not receiving access to core. And that could be considered a change, right? So those are things we have to keep be mindful of. Additionally, if you're pulling a student out of class and they've, calmed down, they're ready to go back, they've, demonstrated that they're ready, willing, and able to go back, and the gen ed teacher says, or whoever the teacher is, says, you know what, I am not ready for that student to come back to my class yet. I have not calmed down. That is considered that can be considered a suspension, right? Because the student's ready to go back and you're not, so that can count toward that 10 days. So be mindful of that. If the student is ready to go back and an adult is saying, I don't want that student to come back, that can count towards those 10 days. So just things to kind of keep in mind and think about when we're talking about classroom removals or in-school suspensions. So again, that in-school suspension, it counts toward the 10-day rule for manifestation determination. And that's when our student is no longer having access to peers, to the gen ed curriculum, special education services, et cetera. After going through the modules, are there any questions about manifestation determination, the 10-day rule? And I know one person asked a question about pattern of removals. So we will answer that one a little bit later. But any other questions related to the module? They're just waiting for you, Diana and Rachel.
We do have one question.
Oh,
Oh,
Rebecca.
it's incomplete, so I'll let them finish.
You can also come off mute, Rebecca. What if the student has in-school suspension and access to their peers? So that's a good question, and that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later as well. Um, things to consider, it definitely in-school suspension, they might have access to their peers, but do they actually have access to the general education curriculum, all of their special education services, and not an alternate, right? Not a worksheet or something like that, right? But like what the rest of the class is doing. It is really hard to duplicate. Basically, you have to replicate that gen ed classroom in school suspension. So for all practical intents and purposes, that's not happening. It's considered um, a, a removal it counts toward those days. Do you want to add on to that, Steph?
No, Rachel just dropped into the chat though that what is the name of that document, Rachel?
That is the manifestation determination review guidance document.
Thank you. So that will be really helpful. And I feel like that is a newer resource that we have.
Yes, that's
Yep,
new.
May of 2026, hot off the presses. The behavior team does a really nice job of they've created so many resources for all things behavior. The beautiful thing about the Idaho Training Clearinghouse is it really does house everything you need to get a really strong understanding of just foundations of behavior, as well as discipline procedures and things that you need to keep in mind. You don't have to go outside the state for that. They've done a great job. Okay, so out of school suspension, they no longer have access to gen ed curriculum, special education services, and participation with peers. That counts toward that 10-day rule. If you're sending them home for the day, same thing. That counts toward that 10-day rule.
Even if the parent is the one that decides they want to come get the student.
So that can get tricky, right? Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
when a student's having a particularly difficult day, or the student has a one-on-one, and let's say that one-on-one is out, they don't have a sub, or the sub is maybe not trained to work with the student. Sometimes a school district, or sorry, a school might call the parent and say, hey, you know what? Just so you know, this is the situation we're under, and it might be best to keep the student home for the day. We can't do that with the right. That's going to be counted toward that 10 days. We can't coach parents to not send their kids to school, even when we know it's going to be tough. We as adults have to really think outside the box and figure out how we can collaborate to make that a successful day for the student. Rachel, you came off mute. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, those are considered informal removals, right? If the student has a particular bad day and a parent makes the choice to come and pick up, if it's a result of a pattern of behavior that's occurring, it would benefit the school to document it as an informal removal.
Yep. Thanks, Rachel. And yeah, sometimes parents will request to take their students home. And same thing, like what Rachel just said, we really need to consider if it's due to a behavior or due to perceived potential difficulties due to behavior, then that needs to be documented that same way.
The reason behind like the documentation of those removals and just like when we're establishing that pattern, right? It helps the school team to look at that behavior and why it's occurring, all the like what we're doing or what is in place currently now may not be enough to support the student. So, there's always, like a one-off some situations, behavior happens sometimes, but when we start to see that pattern emerge, that's when we want to know, like all right, the supports we have are not enough for the student. What do we need to do? How do we address this? How do we support the student? And those be able to look at it from like a data standpoint of this student has left however many days, those behaviors have occurred, how often. That's part of the package that you'll be looking at to help make decisions around the support the student needs. If
Okay,
that makes
Dave,
sense.
would you mind unmuting and asking your question, I'm not sure what you mean.
Okay, so, and this has been years ago when I was a teacher in the day treatment program. I had a student who so student was in a regular classroom. He was an IP student, but a general classroom. The team, which did not include me, decided that they he was a behavior problem, and so they basically wanted him out of the classroom and went from general ed classroom to home instruction. And I put a formal letter in the IEP saying I disagreed with the meeting. I don't know whatever happened to it. They did what they want to do, but what's I mean, is that just something that I should have taken farther, or what was the proper protocol that I should have done?
So you were the special ed teacher, but you were not part of the IEP team?
No, I was the day treatment teacher, which was
Okay.
a half day classroom where they would come, basically. Now this is 25 years ago, so it's changed quite a bit.
Mhm.
Um, but it was, basically they would come to me half a day.
Okay.
They were in their regular classroom, then they would come to a different school.
And so the team determined that the student should be removed fully from school and
I
receive
think the
home ground
principal really
instruction?
wanted the child removed fully, and
Okay.
that's why I dissented on it.
Um, yeah. Uh, I don't know how I feel about that. Anyone else want to?
So, I mean, essentially, bottom line is that it's the LEA representative on the IEP team is going to make that decision that school personnel can't reach a consensus. If somebody is violating IDEA, you've spoken to the special ed director, you've expressed your concerns in writing, and why it's a violation of IDEA. There are other venues that you can take, including filing a complaint with the state if necessary.
Okay,
Um,
excellent.
in in the chat and in the upcoming IEP guidance handbook, there is actually this wording that I just stuck in, and it just told me that it's too many words, so I have to shorten it. But
Yeah,
basically, it explains, and it's also in the special education manual what you do when your team fails to reach consensus for sure.
perfect.
And
So
then,
Vanessa,
yeah,
I get in a situation sometimes at the school where we have kids who are supposed to go to a small group setting for testing as part of their IEP, and the kids refuse to exercise that part of the IEP. I've contacted our IEP, our special ed student service advisor. They basically have told us that if the kid refuses that service, we are to document, and then we also are to contact the parents that they chose not to exercise that
Mhm.
part of the IEP.
and that really needs to come back to an IEP team meeting, right? Because
Yeah.
if you have a student that for whatever reason is choosing not to access part of their IEP, then we need to figure out why. Is it because he's embarrassed? He doesn't want to be singled out? Is it because he doesn't feel like it's helpful? Is it because it gives him anxiety? Like, what is the cause? We'll treat it like a behavior. Try to figure out, okay, why is the student doing this? And then and determine if there's a change that needs to happen to the IEP. Just documenting it isn't really enough, right? Because there's an issue. The child's behavior is telling you that there's an issue, and the team needs to come together and problem solve and figure out what's going on. How can we support the student? All right,
It's
moving
also
on. Oh, go
it's
ahead.
also important to remember too, these when we make these team decisions, they're meant to be beneficial for the student. So if you have a pattern of documentation that says that this student isn't accessing this support or they're resistant to it, what Vanessa said is very true. But also, we need to remember we're not here to make kids do anything. We're here to facilitate opportunities for them, right? Like it's just not part of what our scope of practice is to force children to do anything, right? So the documentation piece is super important because it shows your due diligence to implement what was written into the IEP, but then coming to the table and saying, listen, this really is not working. The same way we would look at interventions, right? Like RTI, we're looking at how well the student is responding to this intervention that we're providing for the student. If they're not responding, then we do something to change it. The same thing would be true for these kinds of accommodations or things. If the student's refusing to participate, there's a reason why.
Yep. Thanks
May I
for
ask a quick question about what was posted in the chat box? It says that If these attempts to resolve the dispute fail or are refused, the proposed IEP shall be implemented unless a due process hearing request is filed, blah, blah, blah. Should that say shall not be implemented unless a due process hearing request is filed? No? Okay.
No. Um,
So we continue to allow something to exist, even though there's disagreement, we still implement it.
so unless, yes, unless there is if you're talking about if a team member, like not a parent, but a different school personnel can disagree, you're still going to implement it. The LEA, if that means that representative, and then ultimately the special education director is going to make that decision.
Okay.
If it's a team disagreement, yeah. If it's a parent disagreement, that's different.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, I think this is just there can be a lot of gray area in this area of concern. And in our situation recently, we had a parent that demanded that we call her when her student was escalating. We didn't want him to go home. We can't provide therapy at home. We can't change behaviors when they're at home. So we wanted him to stay at school. And the mom said, I want you to call me when he gets escalated, and she wanted that in the crisis plan. So we put it in the crisis plan. We would call her, and then she'd come and get him anyway. And we didn't document that. We never called. I mean, we just called and said, he's starting to escalate. We've got things under control. And then she would show up and just take him home. Like
That's a tough, I've been in that situation also where, and parents want to protect their kids, right? They want to protect their children, and they don't want their children to be in a situation that's maybe unsafe or uncomfortable or causing distress. And
mhm.
so if that is a pattern, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, if you're seeing that pattern, then something is probably not very effective with the behavior plan, right? If that's an ongoing thing. And so sometimes that needs to be looked at. Are we addressing the function of the behavior, et cetera? And is this appropriate? But also it really goes back to that relationship and that trust, and having those honest conversations with parents saying, look, I get it. It's uncomfortable knowing that your kid is escalating. And I know that when I call you, it stresses you out. And then you want to fix the situation by coming to get him. But how can we move together to a situation or a solution where the student is able to stay, because what we're doing is not working for the student, right? And so really trying to problem solve multiple facets of that, right? Because it's not just the student escalating, but also the parent feeling like they need to come rescue the kid or come get the kid for whatever reason to get them out of that situation. So there's multiple
And
problem
there's
solving pieces there.
just to add on, Vanessa, too, it is highly dependent on the student, right? But um, if a student learns that if I, escalate my behavior to this point, and then the parent comes and, takes the student out, if the behavior's function is to escape, school or a task or a situation or a part of the environment, and then the parent comes in and removes the student from that environment, right? It's serving that function for that behavior. It's acting as reinforcement. And so that would be a cue for the team to kind of consider how we need to respond to the student, right? Are we inadvertently, strengthening this behavior by allowing, having the parent pick the student up and kind of having the conversation with the parent come through that lens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we did. I mean, this student had full wraparound services and everything, right? So there's a team of 20 people trying to help this one student. Everybody's on board except the parent. And but we felt it was important to notify the parent. She was going to get notified one way or another, because
Right.
ultimately it was a restraint or a seclusion that she was going to get notified anyway of. And so she wanted to preempt that, and then she would come and get them. And parents have more rights than we do. So which, fine, but if they showed up, I'm just saying, I just want to clarify, if the parent just shows up and we have not said anything other than they're escalating, we've got things under control,
I would
that's
still
on them.
document it though.
Mhm.
I would definitely document it, and I would make sure that if anytime in this situation or any other situation where you have a behavior that is not decreasing when a behavior intervention plan has been implemented and you're seeing an increase or you're seeing that the behaviors are about the same, something isn't working. And then that is a signal. Okay, just like academic, when you're looking at interventions or progress monitoring, something isn't working and we have to come back together and figure out what that is. And sometimes inadvertently, people will escalate a situation without understanding that they're actually making this, adults will accidentally make the situation worse oftentimes, right? Without realizing that's what they're doing. And so really taking a close look um, at what is going on with the interactions with the adults too, and the whole situation when that student is starting to escalate what happened before, taking a look at that. But we're going to get deeper into that a little bit later. So I want to move on from that right now. Stacy asked a question, is there a suggestion? I love being recorded. Is there a suggested system of documentation for removals? I think a lot of schools use Skyward or whatever their student information system
SIS,
is.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Transportation. So if yeah, so a suspension from the bus is considered a suspension from school, and that counts toward that 10-day rule because they don't have access to FAPE, right? And then for an interim alternative educational setting, IAES, for up to 45 days, that's something that can take place. So with there is the weapons, controlled substances, or serious bodily injury that's taking place. The IEP team can determine that an alternative educational setting is appropriate. And then pattern of behavior. We touched on this a little bit earlier. If you see a pattern of behavior, it could be attendance, the students not coming to school. It could be every day at math, the kids blowing out. It could be that they're refusing their services. It could be that, whatever it is, don't wait. Put on your problem solving hat and start figuring out what is the function, what is going on, and look at what the classroom environment is, right? Take a really good look about what's going on in that student's environment. Um, and make sure that individual student instruction and supports are in place and that they're appropriate for the student. Just like when you have a student is making errors in reading, let's say they're struggling with multisyllabic words, or let's just for simplicity's sake, say they're struggling with the long vowel sounds. We know we need to target those long vowel sounds, right? There's an error being made and we know we need to target it. Behavior is the same thing, right? There's something is not going well and we need to figure out what it is and we need to intervene, right? And change what we're doing as adults. So don't wait until 9 or 10 days to start thinking about why that behavior is taking place, why that student's blowing out of class or whatever it is. Start thinking functionally as soon as you see that pattern. And then the manifestation determination document, I'm sure you guys have all read that about that in the module online. Any questions about conducting that process, the MDR process? Okay. If you guys have questions that you don't want to ask while we're recording, feel free to ask us when I stop recording or send us a help desk request or just an email as well. All right. So sometimes I think people think that if we go through a manifestation determination hearing and it's determined to be a function or not to be a function of the student's disability, bottom line is we're still responsible for providing FAPE, right? So at the end of the day, we still need to provide FAPE regardless of the outcome. It's not about whether or not the punishment is appropriate. We're looking at whether or not the behavior is a manifestation of that student's disability. And as always, thanks to these lovely BCBAs that we have on staff, there are a million. Okay, that might be a slight exaggeration, but there are thousands of resources on the ITC for behavior. This Educator's Guide to Student Discipline and Supports. Steph is going to put that in the chat. That should be bookmarked. It should be printed. Every administrator in your district should have access, in your LEA should have access to this Educator's Guide to Student Discipline and Supports. That is something that is basically, that's your Bible for discipline and support, especially when looking at special education. And then, of course, we have what to expect discipline. There's parent resources. And then that behavior topic page has all of the things, and it's very well done and very well organized. That link is in the SPED 101 document of all the links that we talk about during class. Okay, now I'm done talking.
Wait, Vanessa,
Yes.
I'm going to put one more topic page link in the chat since your module did cover information specific to PBIS and ITBS. I just put the Idaho Tiered Behavior Supports topic page in the chat as well.
Okay. If you're thinking that you've already seen some of these links, you're not wrong. All of these links are in the module. But sometimes I know it can be overwhelming trying to find all the things all the time. So we're giving you multiple ways, and don't feel overwhelmed if we keep sending you links. Just depends on how you like to receive them. All right. Here is our first question of the day. So these are the questions that were submitted onto that form. According to our student handbook, a behavior plan.
Wait, hold on. I
What?
think we want to give our caveat before we jump in.
Oh, yes. Thank you.
So we're going to do our best to answer the questions that were submitted. Understand that ultimately final decisions need to be made and discussed as an IEP team. We are not IEP team members. We do the best we can to sometimes answer student-specific questions with the information and context that we have. We answer questions kind of as they're given to us, but the answers, depending on your context, may or may not apply, right? So you really need to consider the whole context of the situation, ultimately discuss it and make decisions as a school team. Rachel, anything else?
Nope, it's just behavior is super individualized, and you may be asking us a question with a certain scenario or situation or student in mind, and without having that full context behind that behavior or behind your question, we're going to do our best to answer and try to get to the bottom of what you're asking. But know that that's it could change depending on the situation or the more details that we get.
Yep. And sometimes people don't realize some of those other details are important, and so they don't give us that information. And so then our answer would change, right, depending on that context. So again, these are wonderful BCBAs, but sometimes if we don't have all the information, we might not give an answer that makes sense for that particular situation. Okay.
And with that said, if you do have a deeper you've got a question that you want to dive deeper in, please use the help desk. That's what we do. We answer student-specific support. We can work with your school team and provide that feedback and look at, go do a full records review. We can talk to staff. We can help you and your school team, come to the best possible solution for a specific student's, scenario. So use the help desk if we're not getting deep enough for you.
Thanks for the reminder. And Diana, as always, is on the ball and stuck that link to the help desk. That should be bookmarked as well. If you ever want to get a hold of us, we're just a click away. All right, question number 1. Are we ready? Any other things I forgot? Okay. According to our student handbook, a behavior plan is required upon a student's second suspension-worthy offense. However, a challenge arises when 2 incidents leading to suspension involve distinct and unrelated behaviors. For example, one suspension for vaping and another for academic dishonesty. This situation complicates the development of a targeted and effective behavior plan.
Diana, do you want me to go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I appreciate a school handbook. They are a necessity. They are definitely something that can help school teams guide and run decision making, and then how to respond with discipline. When we have a student with an IEP and we're trying to make disciplinary decisions around how to support or how to respond to that student's behavior, it may not align with your handbook, right? So you just kind of have to have that flexible thinking around how are we going to support the student? Because when we look at behavior, behavior is ultimately a form of communication, right? And that student is acting in a way to get a need met, right? When we look at it through that lens, we can then start to think like, what are we not doing, or what can we do better that will help support the student? And so those are the kind of where we need to anchor ourselves when we're talking about student discipline with a student with, all students, but especially with an IEP. And if we have two different behaviors and we want to make sure that, we're giving the resources behind the supports that are warranted. So if we have a one specific behavior that happens in isolation, can we respond with discipline to that student? Yes. Does it warrant a behavior intervention plan? Maybe not, right? Maybe there's other ways that we can support them. Look at like environmental considerations, some foundational supports. Are they being implemented with fidelity? And if not, like how do we shore those things up? And maybe it just we need to put on our thinking functionally caps and start to think about like how can I help meet the student's need without a full behavior intervention plan? Because when we are looking at that super resource intense tier 3 behavior intervention plan, we know that an FBA is what we need to do. We need to go through that assessment process so that we can get the information that we need to be able to build out a successful behavior intervention plan. And all those pieces are pretty resource intense, right? Once we have that plan in place, we need to have staff trained around the plan and, be able to have meetings around how to change and, tweak the plan in order to make the progress that the student should be making. So does one incident, one occurrence of a behavior warrant, or two separate incidences warrant a behavior intervention plan? I'm not sure. Again, it's going to have to be a team decision, but you could find ways to support that student with less intense behavior, less intense than a full-blown behavior intervention plan.
It's
But
also going to be fairly difficult for your team to really write a behavior intervention plan that effectively addresses two very different behaviors, right? If you've got vaping and academic dishonesty, those are very, very different. However, I mean, there might be some things that you can look at for the student overarching. Maybe we're seeing some repeated significant violations of various types because maybe there's changes happening at home. And so can we, like Rachel said, can we maybe implement some environmental supports or maybe add some mentorship? But whether or not a behavior, an explicit complete behavior plan is needed, is probably debatable. As an administrator, if you have an opportunity to communicate how this policy might be difficult and might need to be tweaked, that's an opportunity for you to make some change there. But this would be difficult to really write an effective plan for two very, very different behaviors.
And if the team did determine that a behavior intervention plan is the direction they want to go, I think at that point, when you have two very different behaviors serving or have with different functions, the team would need to make a decision around which behavior is having the most educational impact on the student. So if you've got a vaping or a academic dishonesty, and you're like the team wants to go forward with behavior plan, like we want to throw our resources at one that will make the most difference to support that student in their academic progress. So, the team would kind of need to weigh that out. Which one do we want to, you know, have the full, put all those resources behind, but not totally disregard the other behavior. Like, how can we also support that behavior by maybe thinking functionally, or, some other, like a tier two support, or those environmental, you always want to be thinking about all those behaviors that are coming, are occurring. But again, we want to put our most of our resources towards the one that has the most educational impact, unless, of course, the behavior is a safety concern, and that if the student is doing the harm to themselves or others, that is the behavior that would take precedent.
Thank you, Rachel and Diana. I think one thing to think about too is the when you have a school policy that basically is necessitating quite a few behavior plans being written, what is the quality of those behavior plans? Who is writing them? Who has the time to do it? The expertise? Are there FBAs being conducted prior to those? Is the team really taking a good look at the function of behavior and all the different pieces, or is it just sort of a contract that's being filled out that's not actually teaching towards a replacement behavior? Are
Also,
okay to
the
move on to the
tier
next
one.
one?
Oh, sorry.
Did you say
I
tier
was
one?
just, I was going to add, what does the tier one look like to support overall instruction for every student in the building related to how we're supposed to behave in general? That's another consideration to think about when we're looking at lots and lots of behavior intervention plans and FBAs. What are we doing for everybody first?
Always,
And is
yep.
that a way to support that need as well?
Steph, do you mind if putting those chat links that they are adding to the chat in that SPED 101 Google document that I linked
Sure,
above? Just because if I do it, then everyone will see my mouse going across my screen,
absolutely.
and then they'll eyebrows will start twitching, and then I'll
Maybe
feel
I won't put them in the chats, Vanessa. I can just mention it to Stephanie. The challenging behavior flow chart, it was probably in your course, but that is a really good resource to have teams in front, like have at the team meetings around whether we need to move forward with an FBA and a behavior intervention plan. There's a flow chart that kind of walks that out. It's very clear and pretty user friendly. And we also have a guidance document that supports that flow chart. So, when teams are determining whether a behavior intervention plan is necessary, this is a good resource to reference.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, our next question. What recommendations would you offer to an administrator that is creating behavior plans in cases where there is insufficient data to identify specific functionally related target behaviors? Additionally, are there evidence-based strategies or frameworks for implementing a universal behavior plan that could address such disparate behaviors efficiently while maintaining effectiveness? Really talking mostly about middle and high school students.
So, this one's hard to answer just as far as insufficient data. Like, I'm not really sure like what data was existing, what data is not existing, right? But as a general rule, when we are observing a behavior, we want to have at least three data points, right? We want to be able to establish a pattern that tells us what that function of the behavior is, right? So there may be times where there's often times where we want more than three data points. But if we have three data points and we can clearly establish a pattern, that this behavior is being maintained by, this consequence, and it's happening to meet this need, we're able to move forward with the planning around that function. you may not have all of that information, right, within your FBA, but you can still think functionally. You can still think like, all right, this student, is doing this behavior to get, and this is the response that's happening. So say, you've got a student who is, yelling in class or being, highly disruptive. And then every time, the teacher sends the student out of the classroom, you're able to kind of like think functionally like that, like the student is likely, um, maybe escaping, you wanting to escape the situation. So we can start putting, some, interventions that aren't formal, in place to help address that need, right? And when you are working under that like that the cap of thinking functionally, like you're add to your data, right? Is it working? Is the behavior occur? Is it stopped? Is it, or is it increasing, right? We were able to kind of, add to our a resource pool for data. Um, it doesn't like data doesn't have to be a super drawn out process, right? The FBA, like we really want to have all the data that will support, and then we can establish that pattern. But without it, we can still think functionally. And if you're talking about a student that is like low frequency behaviors, but very high intensity, so you've got, one incident of, extreme physical aggression. It's very difficult to establish complete an FBA around one behavior. So, I would reach out to a specialist or a BCBA or somebody who has a lot of that. Expertise in completing an assessment like that, because there's other sources that you can pull from with that expert eye, you're able to kind of deduce a function. But I would really lean into, going to the FBA module series that we have on the ITC. And we have in module 4, it talks about how to collect effective informed ABC data, and how to collect that indirect data, so that those are like questionnaires or interviews or things like that you can, use as resources, points of data to support the hypothesis, the functional hypothesis that hopefully your ABC data is giving you. But if not, you guys can be thinking functionally that way.
And I'm going to interrupt real
wait.
quick. Oh, sorry.
As-
Go ahead.
As far as a framework or a guide, I think to support developing a behavior plan, I put a link to the behavior intervention strategies tool in the chat. If you haven't seen it, it's super handy dandy. If you're developing a behavior intervention plan, section 3 is really targeted at supporting teams and thinking about, based on the function of the behavior and what the behavior is, what's might be the best fit for addressing setting events or replacement behaviors. And that can be a helpful tool if you're not quite sure where to start or need some ideas for what to put in those behavior plans, as far as actually developing the behavior plan itself. Also, if you're lacking data within the assessment period, sometimes there's a history of behavior or a history of data that you may be able to pull forward, right, from your records review. And if your immediate data is limited, or you really don't have the time to collect more data because the behavior is really significant and resulting in injury, and it's not safe to get multiple data points, again, pulling from some of that historical data can be a helpful strategy as well.
And real quick, if you haven't taken a look at the behavior intervention strategies tool, one of the questions there was about universal behavior plan. The first part of that BIS tool is all about universal strategies. It's definitely, if you're not familiar with it, they did a lot of work to make this tool really accessible to all educators. So oftentimes when you look at like the Sprick and Sprick, or you look at these big behavior manuals, sometimes they can feel overwhelming and they can feel like, oh, I can't, like it's just too much. This is a really nice accessible tool that really is distilled down to the most basic elements, but yet very, very effective and very supportive. So I'm going to share my screen just because sometimes, I mean, I was sharing my screen. I'm going to share a different screen.
Thanks, Vanessa. I was going to ask for you to do
Yeah.
that. Perfect.
What, what were you going to
So
say?
I was going to ask for you to share it.
Oh, yeah.
Map out through it
So
real
if you
quick.
haven't seen it, then click on the link, bookmark it, print it. It should be at your MTSS meetings. Your special ed teacher should have this. Your administrator should have this. What I really like about it is it starts with universal strategies. It talks about the general function based strategies and then replacement behavior and supports for all these different areas, um, and then evidence-based practices. So starting on page 3, this is a list of strategies that can be implemented in addition to Tier 1 ITBS or PBIS. And it's just basic what we should see at every classroom, right? Um, Same thing with general function-based strategies, right? So it talks about sensory, escape, attention, and tangible or access. Sometimes when we use terms like function of behavior and, oh, this is a sensory thing or a tangible thing, I feel like the vocabulary sometimes gets in the way of the very basics of the functions of behavior, which is just to basically either get out of or get away from something or to get something or gain something. So at the end of the day, when we're talking about the functions of behavior, we're just thinking about what are they trying to get or what are they trying to get out of or get away from, right? Um, Now, that's not a behavior, a BCBA talking because they would never say that
Yes,
in
I
such
would.
simple
I
terms.
would
They would
100% say that.
We absolutely would, Vanessa. You're doing great.
Well, so I think sometimes the vocabulary gets in the way of feeling comfortable talking about behavior. And so I just want, if that is the case in your situation or when you're trying to talk to somebody about that, just think about distilling it into what are they trying to get or what are they trying to get out of? And that helps sometimes people think about the why behind the behavior. Anyway, this is a great tool. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because I'll just scroll and you guys will get dizzy and then that's not good. But seriously, click on the link, bookmark it. It is a fabulous resource. I cannot stress enough that every single person who works with students should have access to this tool. This is an amazing tool. It's a great thing to give out to all your teach staff at the beginning of the school year. Please, please, please share this out. And now I'm going to try to remember how to share what I was supposed to be sharing the whole time. Oh, and then the other thing I was thinking about is in the question, what recommendations would you offer to an administrator that's creating behavior plans? Hopefully, it's not just one administrator creating behavior plans. Hopefully, there's a team there and it's not one person by themselves who doesn't have access to the student or know the student very well, or I'm not sure if that was intended, but it might be that uh it might be that you need more support from other professionals in the building.
That's a good point, Vanessa. Actually, is really if you're at the point where you're walking through and considering tier 3 intensive and individualized supports for a student specific to behavior, social, emotional skills, and at that point you should be going through a functional behavior assessment and developing a behavior intervention plan. That should absolutely be done with a team that includes the school, the student's teacher, any staff that are supporting. It should include the administrator. If you have a counselor at the school, that's an ideal team member. And parents. It should include a team. Even if it's a general education student, there should still be a student level team that is working together to complete that assessment and build the plan. It really should not ever ideally rest on a single person's shoulders. The more that you can team, the better your plan is going to be. Teacher input is absolutely critical. Your plan is only as strong as your implementers, right? And if the teacher doesn't support the plan, the teacher doesn't feel like they can implement the plan in their classroom, it's not going to happen, right? And so we need everybody that is really interacting with and supporting that student on a regular basis involved with that student, with that student's team as you're walking through that process.
And as Rachel said, don't forget the school psych, because they are great resources when it comes to looking at functions of behavior as well as behavior plans.
Yeah, school psychs are great. Sometimes when you're talking about gen ed students, sometimes the school psychs are saying, I have so much on my plate that they may or may not have capacity for that, but certainly a great resource if your team has questions.
Okay,
And
move on.
I think along that vein is a lot of times when we're looking at behavior intervention plans or we come in for student-specific support, we are presented with a behavior plan, but not an FBA, right? It feels like, I feel sometimes like when I talk to schools, it feels like a gray area for people because it's not necessarily an IDA requirement unless you have gone through the MDR process, but it is best practice. And we really are going to get a much more effective behavior intervention plan when it's informed by an FBA. So in studies after studies shows, right, we can, when we have functionally based plans, then they're much more effective than when we have, the plan where I'm just kind of I think this will work, and you write a plan around it, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with trying something because you're thinking functionally. But when you put a behavior intervention plan in place, you've got your prevention methods, you've got your how you're going to teach that you select a behavior or replacement behavior, you have the plan on how you're going to teach that replacement behavior, you've got your strategies for how you're going to respond to challenging behavior and to respond to that new behavior you're trying to teach. When that's informed by a FBA, you're going to get a more effective plan, period.
Yep. And if it's worth doing, it's worth doing well. It does, like Rachel said, it takes a lot of time and resources to walk through that process of doing an FBA and a BIP, even developing a BIP. And so if you're going to take the time to develop it and ask someone to implement it, we want to make sure that we've done the assessment piece to make sure that it's most likely to be effective, right? And doing the FBA is the best way to try to ensure that.
And I mean, I think a good perspective to have too is like when we're thinking about the resources behind this assessment or behind a behavior intervention plan, right? Challenging behavior, if we have a student with challenging behavior, that is resource intense, right? We've got students that, if they have a highly, physical behavior or, intense behavior, like we're going to have to write incident reports. We're going to have to do, a debrief meeting. We're going to have to maybe eventually have to go down, and have an MDR or deal with facilitation or, it's hard. It's resource intense either way you look at it. So putting our resources towards something that we know that's evidence-based, that is effective, is where I would put like the most, where you're going to get the most bang for your buck.
But then with that too, we also want to make sure it is time intensive to do these processes. And so also, looking at, do you have a school-wide team that's looking at how we best support all students? Do we have tiered supports both to support students academically and behaviorally, and their social emotional skills? The more we can have some universal practices and systems in place to support all students, you're going to need these more intensive resources less often. But if you don't do that, you're going to end up upside down in how much support you're providing for students that need those things because their needs aren't being met foundationally. And if we can do that as best we can for all students, then you're not going to find yourself going through these more intensive processes near as often.
And if you're having questions around like, well, what are those supports that I'm supposed to be doing? If you're unfamiliar, which I think it was in your module, but the ITBS is Idaho Tiered Behavior Supports, and they are free of charge, and they will come and support your school through multi-years, through every tier, and they've got a plethora of resources. There's, Diana, you know your elevator pitch more better than I do, but
Yeah.
that's something that I would look into if you're really curious about like what universal supports can I add to my school?
Yeah, when we're talking about tiered behavior supports, the best model or framework for that is PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention and Supports. And so, as Rachel said, Idaho Tiered Behavior Supports is the project within SESTA that supports schools in a cohort model by application over a 3 to 5 year process to implement PBIS one tier at a time, and to do that with fidelity. And so not only is it the training, but it comes with explicit resources and ongoing technical support to really help your schools be able to implement PBIS effectively. And so if you're interested in that, all of the information is there. If you already have some things in place and you're just looking for resources, all of our resources are readily available on that topic page as well.
Yep, and this was linked in the module. We added these to the module, both Steph and I did, actually after meeting with these guys, just to make sure that you had them. So I have this pulled up on the ITC, and then I know sometimes it just helps to see it, so I'm clicking on it so you can see. If you need any information on FBAs, functional behavior assessment, the form, the practice guide, a quick guide, a technical handbook, the challenging flowchart, behavior flowchart explained. These resources are fantastic. There's case studies, there's modules. They've made it really, really easy to access these resources. And same thing for the behavior plan. And while I'm here, also we were talking about just those universal supports, right? Things we should be seeing. There's classroom management series. And then also there are para resources. So on the homepage, if you click on paraprofessionals, how to support behavior, how to support academics, there's a ton of resources here as well. And so just making sure that you're familiar with those resources. We have tons of modules and resources to help also with those collaboration days, or any time that you have for para training. There are resources for that as well. Going back to sharing somewhere else, it's always slightly terrifying. All right, next question. There we go. Law 3 says that behavior continues because it is effective. Can you elaborate?
Sure.
Okay. I'll start on this one.
Okay,
Rachel.
go ahead.
So this can be a little bit of a difficult one to understand. So especially when there's students that are engaging in really significant problem behavior and they're throwing tantrums and they're exhausted at the end, right? You look at that and say, how can that possibly be something the student wants, right? And we're not saying that they want to have a tantrum, right? But when we talk about why behavior happens for a reason. Like Rachel said, behavior is communication, it's telling us something. And if it's the student's engaging in that behavior for a purpose, right? We all engage in behavior for purposes, right? We don't do things willy-nilly because we're not going to put forth a lot of effort if it doesn't produce something that we need. And so the student is engaging in that behavior to meet a need. And if that behavior is continuing, despite how exhausting it is or effortful it is for the student, or even if it results in harm to themselves, when we talk about self-injury, that behavior is occurring for a reason. And if that behavior is continuing, then there's a need that's being met through engaging in that behavior, regardless of how difficult or effortful or painful it might be to the student. It is meeting a need. Because if it wasn't meeting a need, they wouldn't continue to do that. And so what has happened is that over time, that behavior has been shaped, that is the most effective, consistent, immediate way that that student has developed skills to meet a need in that given situation. So, for example, with self-injury, I had a student once where they were with force repeatedly hitting themselves in the face, right, in the jaw, in the cheek area. And what we found out through collaborating with parents is that the student had significant dental issues, right? They had teeth that were significantly infected. And so the need was to escape the pain. And even though essentially they were inflicting more pain because it was resulting in bruising and whatnot to their face, it was competing with the pain from their teeth. That's just one example, but if the behavior is continuing, there is some need that's being met by the student engaging in that behavior. And so our job, kind of as educational detectives, is to figure out what exactly is that need. That's part of really one of the biggest pieces of that functional behavior assessment process, is to look at what are the factors that are influencing and maintaining the behavior, and then how can we give the student a different way to immediately meet that need, and how can we adjust factors within the environment so that that behavior is less reinforced. Rachel?
Yeah, and when we're looking at behavior, it's not necessarily like it's hard, as you know, just anybody, I guess it's hard for me sometimes not to look at behavior as like good behavior or bad behavior. When we're looking at it, like this is a student who's trying to get a need met. And when we look at it through that functional lens, right, like, is what are they trying to, what need are they trying to meet? I kind of like threw an example. Diana talked about like a sensory in need with a student with their teeth. I had a kid that was like extraordinarily disrespectful to adults. Just a lot of inappropriate language, and would get um, a lot of attention, right? Whenever that student started to engage in that behavior, it would get a lot of like high quality, right? Like the teacher would react and then would be sent to the principal, where then they would get more attention for that behavior. And so it was very effective for the student. And it comes to find out that the student lived at home with grandma, and grandma was like not very mobile, and didn't have a lot of attention in the home. And this is how they learned that they could get attention, right? Whether it's because when you think about it on like a hierarchy, right, you've got like some like positive attention, you've got negative attention, and then you have no attention at all. And then when the student learns, like, oh, I can do this, and then I get it every time. I'm going to get really good, or I'm going to get high doses of attention after I engage in this behavior, right? It's not necessarily, he's not thinking, it's, good or bad, or he just knows that he's getting attention. So we kind of start thinking about through that cap, like how can we teach that student to get their need met in a more appropriate way, right? Like how can we teach them that this positive, like that, like, not engaging in that challenging behavior can get them some really good quality attention, and make that effective, right? Because right now, in that moment when I walked on the scene, that student's behavior was very effective, right? It got their needs met. And so they continue to do it over and over again.
Rachel, is it possible that the student in that situation you just described is not really thinking consciously about the attention-seeking behavior? It's more of a subconscious thing where they are driven to engage in whatever way just because, like you're saying, that need is being met. I think if we can get away from thinking that, okay, the student is actually thinking through this. If I do this, then this will happen. I just get the sense that it's not really that kind of conscious thought that's driving the behavior.
I mean, if you think about it, when like
Absolutely.
you're engaging with others, right? Like you are like, all right, I'm going to go into the lunchroom to get, good quality attention now, right? Like it's not a very cause and effect, like deliberate thing, right? When we engage in these behaviors, when we do things all day long as just humans existing in the world, it's not a conscious decision when what we're doing to get our needs met. We're just know that we're doing it. And then, that we know how we feel when it's done. So that is very, very, yeah, astute, Andrea, for sure. It's not always a cause and effect.
And I think,
I
and
mean, it
what
is, but not conscious cause and
it's
effect.
not conscious, yeah. And I think sometimes it makes it hard for some people to see the why. They just see the kid, oh, the kid's just being a little monkey butt today. Well, there's a reason that we're seeing this, right? And so we get to put on our little detective hats. In fact, Nate's going to kill me, but we have a coordinator. He's a behavior coordinator. His name is Nate. And he's down in Boise, or he's like I don't know, down there somewhere.
Twin Falls.
In
And
Twin Falls.
so where is he?
Twin
He's in
Falls.
Twin
Twin.
Falls, down there somewhere. And he always wears like these tweed jackets. And I always think about Nate the Great, that book about the little detective, right? And so I'm trying to get him to make a little detective video where he puts on his hat, and it has like a fake pipe, a little bubble pipe or something, and to put on his detective hat and really kind of figure out what is going on with the behaviors, because that's really what we're doing, right? We have to become detectives and figure out the why. And I think sometimes people get stuck in, well, they're not supposed to do that. They know better. Uh, if they knew better, if they knew a better way to do it, um, that was socially acceptable to get their need met, they would do that. Obviously, there's something else going on, and we need to figure out what's going on. All right,
And
moving
there's a
on.
lot of assumptions made with behavior, right? Like because like in one situation, the student may be able to demonstrate that skill, but in another, they don't have access to that skill. And it is a tricky thing to know what is like how can we teach a student to access a skill and generalize it across different environments and different situations. It can be challenging.
One of the analogies I always use is I try to mountain bike to keep up with my family, and I live in Coeur d'Alene, so I have Canfield at my back door. And I have been practicing and practicing and practicing so I can do the jump line and whatnot on Canfield. Well, in Canada, it's all roots instead of rocks, and I cannot generalize my skills on a bike in Canada in Fernie with my family, like because I have to learn new skills. I can't generalize those. And so people think, oh, she can do it here. Why can't she do it there? Because it's a different situation. It might not look different, but it feels very different for me. And so sometimes we think, oh, they can do this in this setting, but they're not doing it in this setting. They're doing it on purpose. Well, I definitely don't want to fall in Canada and Fernie on a mountain bike. It's not intentional, I promise. I didn't fall though.
Good job.
Okay, I keep going, I keep hitting the next slide, but I already clicked it. So, how formal are tier 2 PBIS supports? Could it be that a teacher just knowing that something triggers a student and working to prevent that, or referring to more formal process to identify triggers and corrections for behavior?
I got this one.
Diana is going to get this one. Yep.
So tier two, when we talk about tier two interventions, tier two interventions should be something that's a little bit more formal. What you're talking about here, as far as a teacher thinking functionally, as we've talked about through this morning, thinking functionally and trying some different strategies or supports within the classroom that might meet the student's need, and doing that informally is kind of that tier 1.5, right? Where we're trying some other things that may help support the student. We're talking about tier 2. We're identifying students that are at risk for engaging in more significant behavior. And tier 2 interventions are generally more standard types of interventions that your team has developed, your school-wide team has developed to support students. There's usually a specific process. We recommend thinking about what need, maybe perhaps using a screener and what the function of the behavior is, and using that information to match them to an intervention so that we're making good choices about what intervention to try, and not just saying, oh, okay, we're just gonna put them, assign them a mentor and see if that works, right? We want to really select a meaningful intervention. Tier 2 interventions, there are specific features that a tier 2 intervention should have. They are usually more standard kind of canned interventions. They're not highly individualized. The intention of that is so that we can have preset interventions that are in place that all of our staff are trained on. We've got data sheets ready to go so that as we identify a student in need of that intervention, we can quickly put them or assign them to that intervention and get it started. So it might be things like check in, check out, mentorship, social groups with a counselor of some kind, whether it be working on social, emotional skills or coping skills, behavior contracts, self-monitoring, et cetera, are some examples of tier 2 interventions. So tier 2 interventions are more formal, standard interventions that are implemented for a student.
And you'll see here on the Idaho ITDS site, I was just clicking through, there's tier 1 resources, tier 2 and tier 3. Obviously, tier 1 is under the tier 1 tab, and it has all the resources here online. The next question, as I share the correct screen. Am I sharing a screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. It doesn't, oh, there's a green box. Okay. How do you balance cultural considerations when establishing clear expectations for behavior?
I like the word that I noticed the word balance, right? Because you can do both, right? And culture can influence how people communicate and respond, and show respect and express emotion or respond to authority, right? Like those are all different kinds of considerations that we're thinking about for setting expectations in a classroom or behavior in a classroom. So when when your district recognizes that you have a diverse cultural backgrounds, being cognizant of those different like expectations is important, right? You don't want to totally disregard other, cultural considerations. You want to be mindful of them while you're determining like what those expectations are. So, for example, you say, we were expecting the student to be respectful, right? That might mean something different across different cultures. So clearly defining that and what it looks like in that specific setting is going to be the first thing I would do, or would be the end product, right? But then I would pull, when we're developing that manual or developing what that that value is for us in this school. Pulling it together with a diverse team to kind of, or having the conversation around what respectful looks like in like across cultures and what it looks like here. How can we pull in different cultural um, uh, cultural, I guess, norms into that expectation. So clearly defining it after you kind of set that up and then teaching what that is, and then ask whether that behavior is actually interfering with learning, and if it's going against, that is it actually interfering with learning or safety, or whether it's simply just different from the expect based on our own cultural norms, right? So like, is it having an educational impact on themselves or others? And then if it is, outlining those clear expectations and explicitly teaching, that appropriate behavior would be how I would handle that. Including students and families, people who know the student well in the conversation are, never bad ideas.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, so sometimes it's hard to navigate discipline and manifestation determination. Parents don't always understand their actions are part of the problem. So this person is looking for tips and tools to navigate parents' anger or lack of participation.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's definitely a tricky one. But so while a student is we have really very limited control around what happens with a student once they're outside of school, right? Like we know that, we know that's a limitation. Um, but while a student is at school, we have more influence, right? And we know that we can, especially important, like when we make those clearly outline expectations and the appropriate behavior, relationships, yeah, like everything that we do within the school environment. But also, like building those relationships with families is just as important. If the school eventually needs to hold an MDR review, like that foundation of trust can help families understand that that is just a formal process to look at the situation from all angles, right? And in that conversation with families, I would really like put up front and be really communicative around the spirit of an MDR, right? It's not meant to excuse behavior because the student has a disability, and it's not for just like a procedural hurdle before you go ahead and you can discipline a student, right? Like it's a protection that's designed to make sure that the student isn't significantly removed from their educational placement, right? Like it's a protection for both the school and staff, right? Like it's a way that we can um, look at objectively. It's a formal place in a conversation to talk about what we've done, where the student currently is, what's in place, what's working, what's not working. It's like it's a stopping point for the team to be like, all right, like we've got to do something here, right? And pulling families into that conversation is very helpful because, as we know, like there are outside influences that we don't have a lot of control over. So when we have them on our side, it's really helpful. But I think in that conversation with families, just putting the spirit of like why we're doing having an MDR, it will help build that trust. And then help like, in that development of, supports that could change, that might need to be amended in the IEP or adding a FBA. Um, we just don't want to like use the MDR as an avenue for automatically dismissing behavior, right? Just like, oh, they have a disability, it's fine. Or like, oh, like the student had a bad behavior and, we're going to discipline them and they're out of school suspension. So we've got to kind of meet in the middle of like how we can best support that student and then that conversation happen. Like hopefully it's happening before you get to the MDR. But the MDR is that place like that it's like stop. Here we're going to look at all this stuff and we're going to have a conversation about it. So the more you pull in parents and how are communicative about like that spirit, I feel like would be pretty helpful.
So much boils down to relationships. And
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's no different from our students, right? That if we haven't done all the pre-work to proactively try to build relationships before we've got significant problem behavior or before we're having to call parents to manifestation, it's going to be more of a struggle, right? So that preventative and proactive attempts and actions to build meaningful relationships with parents, not just around calling when their student does something wrong, is really going to be helpful to build that relationship and try to pre-establish that you're all on the same team, you're all working to support the student is really impactful. Sorry, go ahead, Vanessa.
nope, that's exactly what I was, right? It's always about relationships, building trust, connecting before you're correcting. You have to take the time to get to know the families, to build that trust. It takes time. It doesn't just happen in a day. And you know, they, like you said, they have to know that you're on the same team. It's us versus the world, not us versus the parents, the families, right? And they know if you don't like their kid, right? I mean, you really have to work hard to make sure that the kids know that they're loved and valued at the school, right? That they're respected as human beings and that you are there to support them and you are there to help them. And even if they make a mistake, even if they do something that is not kind to somebody else or that is harmful, we're still here to support them and to help them. It's not an us versus them thing.
In those moments where you have a parent that refuses to attend or participate in the MDR process, they are a required uh, participant for in the MDR, and you have to have their support. So if the parent does not come, I would definitely document everything that you can around, you can't make a determination without the parent there. But as far as defensibility and and protection for the school and for the kid, right? Because you've gotten to this point because something's not working. So you can start having those conversations around, or make sure you're documenting those conversations, what the school does plan to do, and make sure that everything is like very well brought out, and then maybe reach out to a facilitator, to have somebody, who can, you know, help facilitate those meetings, and make sure that it kind of goes smooth if you're in a spot where you can't hold that MDR because a family member refuses to attend.
Yep, and always documenting not just what the decision is, but your attempts to contact the family in
Yep.
multiple ways, multiple avenues.
Yep.
All right, how can we balance the educational rights of one student who demonstrates unsafe and disruptive behavior while honoring the rights of all students to a safe and productive learning environment?
Always such a tricky one, because it's really important, right? And then I think a lot of times, um, we're looking at it as an either or kind of situation where it's not that way, right? Like it's a difficult balance. Um, so, and Diana, like feel free. I feel like I'm talking a lot, so feel free to jump in, whatever. But it's not it's not okay because a student has a disability for us to tolerate unsafe or highly disruptive behavior because that student has a disability, right? That's not our intention. At the same time, repeatedly removing a student without asking whether their educational programming is adequate, right? Like that's not doing a service for that student either. So, right, how do we need to be able to ask those questions and have like our system set up in a way that is gonna lean towards a productive learning environment. So if that behavior is significantly interfering with the learning or safety of others, right, we've identified that. We need to take a closer look, right? We need to look at the current supports that student has, the behavior plan, like potentially their placement, like what are our options? How do we support this student and how do we maintain that like the safety for all? And a lot of times when I'm providing support in schools, well, we don't have that option here. That continuum is very rigid. And when we're looking at students with severe challenging behavior, in that moment, right, that moment, that student may need, um, like, supports, and while they're learning, they might need a more restrictive environment. And what that looks like doesn't necessarily have to be in seclusion, right? Like it takes creativity, and resources. And I'm not trying to discount the effort behind supporting a student with challenging behavior because it is significant. And the resources really are unbalanced in a way, but that doesn't negate the fact that we still have to provide those supports, right? It feels heavy, but there's a solution. And when we get to that point of safety, we really want to be mindful of that, and we don't want the student to continue to engage in that behavior. We want to teach them how to get their needs met in a more appropriate way. And is learning for that student going to be able to happen in the general education environment, or does it have to happen, in a modified kind of way? And those are questions I think schools kind of limit themselves with sometimes, being like, this is the what we offer, we are inclusion only, or we are, like that our behavior program doesn't offer that, or, it when we think about it for like what's available, you've got a lot of options. It's just we have to be creative about it. And you're right, it does take a lot of administrative flexibility to be able to create those environments. And I'm not trying to discount that because believe me, I know it's tough. But again, when we are looking at the situation as like the student is unsafe and causing harm to everyone, but yet neither of those things are okay.
I put out a link for Circle of Friends. That's just the Nebraska Autism Spectrum Disorders Network one. There's years ago, because I'm old, right? So back in the before time, there was a great book called Circle of Friends. If you guys know it, shout out because I'll get all excited. But essentially, you're training peers to interact with kids who are really struggling socially or with behaviors, and really enveloping that child in the classroom and making sure that they know they belong. So oftentimes, kids with really significant issues with academics, behavior, or whatever it is, don't feel that sense of belonging. And so really making sure that we're working hard to create that sense of belonging in the classroom really goes a long way to decreasing those behaviors that are causing unsafe and disruptive behavior in the classroom. So Circle of Friends, that link I just stuck in there is just one of there's a million links. It looks like now they have pay for coaching for, I'm not trying to tell you to go spend money and buy stuff, but just the concept of it. I've done this program with students before, and I'm thinking of a second grade class in particular, and it was just such a powerful way to help the other students understand what was going on with that one student, but also he had a whole classroom of teachers supporting him with his behaviors, really reinforcing those positive things, and it made a big difference in his life.
Absolutely. And it's like, I feel like a lot of times when this comes up, it's like it always becomes down to like I feel a little defensive in this kind of situation because people are always posing it in a way of whose rights matter more. And it's not like that's not really the way I view it. It's just like, what do we need to do differently that so all students can be safe and access their education, right? Like it, it, I don't know. But yeah, I think if that you have a student where their needs may need more of a flexible place, like, but always having a path back towards that general education and back towards that sense of belonging, right? Like the stronger that we can teach those behaviors, and then generalize them and get them feeling safe again in their and everyone in that classroom, right? Like just always having a plan of how we're going to get back and get that student back into general ed.
And I'm sharing now what that link, that Universal Crisis Plan, what
Yeah.
it looks
And so,
like.
so my thought here was again, one of the things that's helpful in supporting all students and valuing the rights of all students is to have a plan in place. And so uh, kind of pre-arming your staff with an understanding of what the escalation cycle looks like for students and some ways that they can respond to de-escalate, and then pre-establishing routines and procedures within your building and within classrooms for how to respond and what to do if we find ourselves in a crisis situation or with an escalating student, so that we can, of course, best support that student specifically, but then also maybe have pre-established routines for how we exit the classroom if a student is having a really tough time, and so their learning continues and it's not it doesn't feel scary or hectic, right? We have pre-established routines that are pre-taught, and so again, that preventative piece around some of those procedures can help keep everyone supported and calm and all of that as well.
And also keeping in mind, as adults, oftentimes we are part of the problem, and really taking a look at our actions and the actions of our fellow educators. Not that it's intentional. None of us would ever want to do that intentionally, but we sometimes unintentionally back kids into corners. We, strip away their dignity. And when you back a kid into a corner, you just that's yeah, exactly. Stacy went like this. Ha! You just created a problem, right? If you back a kid into a corner, now you have somebody who's willing to fight to get out, and that's never a good situation. So always going back to what are the adults in the situation doing that is contributing to the problem and not the solution. Uh, Sorry, I'm slow in my sharing things. All right, here we go. One of the
Vanessa,
most, oh yes.
really quick, I'm going to drop the modules for, so we have a series of modules that kind of go along with what Vanessa was just talking about. Oftentimes we see behaviors for various reasons that we've discussed today, but sometimes our gen ed partners don't understand what their responsibilities are related to students with disabilities in their classrooms and how to support their needs, like implementing accommodations, IEP goals in the classroom, um, what their role is in the process in general. And so sometimes through no fault of their own, they are doing these things to exacerbate what's happening. So we have a series of modules to support that, like maybe front loading that for your gen ed partners, your classroom teachers, about what their responsibilities are related to students with disabilities in their classrooms. And so I'm going to put those in the chat and then also in the Google Doc.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Most important steps school administrators can take to be proactive with students with behavior challenges.
I think maybe this might be a good place to plug the Beacon project. There's a project that SESTA we have for school staff that really walks through the basics of behavior and how to look at the FBA process, the BIP process, and implementation of those supports and the crisis plan and progress monitoring and kind of it does it's a year-long course that trains your school staff. It is it is a SESTA program, so it's free of charge. You might have to pay for the credits, but it's a year-long process where every month you have a different module, similar to kind of what you guys are going through, and have support of a BCBA throughout the year to be able to walk through the application and be supported with their learning throughout each module, and then they work together with a cohort. So, what other districts doing, what other, they kind of can lean on each other for that community support. But that's a really great place to resource to provide for staff who, if you have students with challenging behavior, to be able to get that training. But I think overall, right, like it's a tough question. It's a big job. Staffs and peers and students need protection. But I think if we talk about the most important step is to make sure that like those actions are clearly explained. And to everyone, right? Like having that system of support, being able to demonstrate the concerns and identify be a place where they can get identified early, have a meeting time where the team can respond to those concerns, in a way that's productive and where decisions can be made. So, if that's in your MTS meetings, if that's in a PLC time, I don't know, about having a place for staff to be able to have those conversations around what we can best do to support these students. I feel like that's a really helpful part of their system. And then too, just like once you've agreed on those supports, like having a way to monitor their implementation, right? Like I having worked in schools for years, like we all know that things come up and things like it's not a perfect place where we look at the plan and are working our way through step 1 through 10, in an uninterrupted kind of clinical way. So things can get dropped inadvertently. It's not to anyone's fault, but as an administrator, being able to, objectively look at a plan and be able to like, is my staff able to be able to implement these things? Do they have the resources in order for them to, implement these supports for students? I really feel like that's, having the system around that is going to be the most bang for your buck. Having
100%,
those clear,
Rachel.
yeah, documentations, right? Like those that consistent problem solving process.
We're going to keep moving just because we have, I want to make sure we get to all of our answers and then we can go back and elaborate more if we want to dive deeper into anything. The only thing I would add on to that is relationships. One of the best ways you can be proactive with a student with behavioral challenges is get to know them and make sure that that kid knows that you are there for them and that you're there to support them. Build that relationship. What were you going to say, Rachel?
I did want to add here too, it's as an administrator, you've got a lot of hats, right? Like the buck stops oftentimes with you. So having your system set up for a defensible practice, right? It's not about really creating that more paperwork or stress overlooking your staff, right? It's just kind of like the school should be able to tell a clear story. We identified a concern, we responded, we monitored the response, and we adjusted when the student needed something different, right? Like, and then how do we demonstrate that? How do we put that in writing so that, like, that we are able to look at our practice and like defend it, right? Like, well, this is what we've done, and this is what we've supported. This is how we've talked to parents. This is what we've done so that this process can be, and then through that, you can build those relationships, right? Because you can explain that to family. You can explain that to staff, and if something comes up because things do, those schools' decisions are defended, right? And then if there's a review later, I mean, that's, I think, where I would put them, yeah, definitely around those processes, solving
Yeah,
problems.
I think clear systems, right? Clear systems in supporting your staff, systems for training your staff and ensuring that they have the tools and strategies that they need to have effective classroom management skills and to build routines and systems within their classrooms. So having the systems in place, providing the training, providing the tools, right? Because that is, again, your foundational prevention, right? If we don't have a process for that, we have teachers that are going to do the best they can, but they're ill-equipped to know what to do when behavior arises.
And I'm going to stick another link in the chat. It's the National Center on Intensive Intervention, the Behavior Support for Intensive Intervention course content. If you have already ingested and digested and it's percolated everything on the ITC, you are amazing. And if you're hungry for more, you can go there. But basically, it's just supporting everything that these lovely coordinators, SESTA coordinators, and other CVAs with SESTA have already put on the ITC. Damaging property, not a threat to themselves or others.
So for this one, if you have a student that's damaging property, if we're talking about in the moment, you want to do the best you can to de-escalate. But if they're not hurting anybody, that is not a justification to put hands on the student. You definitely want to be familiar with restraint and seclusion policies and state law. This can be a difficult situation because if you have a student that just chucked a fairly expensive computer across the room, right? It's tough. But we have to make sure that we're following the law. Again, the best reaction is prevention, right? The best way to not get here is to prevent it from happening in the first place. Again, having all of your staff trained and equipped with knowing how to try to de-escalate an escalating situation as quickly and effectively as possible. But we want to be careful. Anytime you put hands on, anytime you start putting lots of demands or start, that's not okay, we can't do that. And you have a student that's in crisis, they're not, you sound like the Peanuts parents, right? Wah, 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 right? Anything we say isn't really going to make it better. So your best, the best you can to de-escalate, try to calm the student down, shifting them to think about or engage in something else. I've had a student destroying a classroom when I sat on the floor safely with a puzzle, right? And I just started doing something that I knew the student may have, so not a preferred activity, right? But something that I might be able to get the student distracted in. And it was enough to shift their attention and at least stop the immediate problem behavior. But definitely be familiar with restraint and seclusion procedures, know your district's policies and procedures around those things.
Yep.
And if it's happening in a frequent amount of time, you can definitely, and it's, having an impact on them in their education, I would definitely think about what's happening before, during, and after that behavior, right? Like establishing those patterns.
Dave mentions that taking turns working with hard students, building relationships with students and staff alike. I can't tell you the number of times I've been the one who's called to get a student out of a situation where they're destroying property simply because I had a relationship with them. They weren't my student, but I could say something goofy. One time it was getting a kid to race me back to the office backwards. That worked. I don't know why it worked that day, but we got him out of the classroom and the computers were saved. So again, I feel like I'm a broken record. I keep saying build relationships, but all right, next question. Systems in place to monitor and support fidelity of PBIS, BIPs, other interventions. I've got a link for that. You want to take that one, Diana?
Yeah, I was talking. You just couldn't hear me because I was muted. There are a variety of systems in place when you talk about monitoring fidelity. For PBIS, there is the tiered fidelity inventory, the TFI. And as soon as I'm done talking, I'll put links in the chat. I just can't do both at the same time. There is the tiered fidelity inventory. It is linked on the PBIS page under the Tier 1 tab. The tiered fidelity inventory looks at some key systems and practices for each tier of PBIS. It is a self-assessment that can be completed with your PBIS team. That's a good way to identify strengths and needs and support planning. We know that PBIS is not, it's not just a set it and forget it, right? Where you check the box and one time we say, yep, we did that, it's there, and we never have to look at it again. It's really a continuous improvement process. So that is one way to look at your fidelity. Also looking at collecting, if we're talking PBIS specifically, perhaps collecting office discipline referrals and looking at those numbers. And I'm going to talk about very specific reports if you're using Swiss to track data or there's other systems that will do it for you, but looking at your triangle data to say how effective are we at supporting students at each tier. And so what that does is looks at students with 0 to 1 office discipline referrals, right? Major office discipline referrals. Ideally, we want that to be at 80%. We want to be supporting at least 80% of our students with our universal systems and practices. Tier 2 should be around 10 to 15%, students that need some of those standard interventions as a secondary layer of prevention. And then Tier 3 should be no more than 3 to 5% of our students that are needing those intensive and individualized interventions and supports. Fidelity of behavior intervention plans, there are implementation checklists that you can use, and I can link to a template that's available on the ITC as far as looking at all of our staff implementing the plan as intended. Those implementation checklists can be helpful. if you're, depending on what evidence-based practices you're using, the Affirm website also has some really great implementation and fidelity checklists to help monitor fidelity of implementing those evidence-based practices as well. Rachel, anything else?
I think you hit the nail on the head. The checklists are quick and easy, painless, right? It's not necessarily a compliance tool. It's not like, are my staff doing what they said? No, it's like, can they? Are they? Is it effective? Are they doing it what they can? And if they're not, well, how can I support them? Does
And
the
the
staff need
intensive
more
intervention link also,
training?
so she's going to drop some in there, links in there, but also there's on the intervention and intensiveintervention.org site, there's the student intervention implementation log, there's a rubric and interview, and then there's the student level plan fidelity checklist as well. So just lots of options for, and oh, yep, you dropped the fidelity inventory in there as well. All right, next question. What exactly constitutes a pattern of removals? And let me link the quick guide in the chat. You guys want to talk about that real quick?
But I'm trying to do resources at the same time. Yeah. So pattern of removals. If we are, and Vanessa touched on this a bit earlier, and Stacy, Rachel, feel free to jump in. If we are consistently removing a student where they are missing out on core instruction or access to intervention or access to peers, we need to be looking at that, right? And saying, who does this student need additional support? If a student is constantly losing their recess, or like Vanessa said earlier, if the student's always being removed during math, or they're getting escalated and we're sending them to the intervention room and they're spending the next hour there, but we're not really documenting that anywhere, we've got a problem. We want to know if a student is missing class time so that we can then be flagged, right? If we don't know that it's happening, if it's not being documented and there's a pattern, we want to know about it. The sooner we know about it, we can do something about it. As an administrator, if you don't know that a student is consistently being removed from the classroom, or the interventionist is having to come de-escalate, or they're spending half of the day every day in the counselor's office, you can't support the team in moving forward with next steps. And so we need to have a way to document those things so that we can identify the patterns and determine how to move forward with next steps in supports.
And oftentimes the administrators know because they're in their office or down the hall from them, but the special ed teachers don't get told. So then if you're a special ed teacher and you have no idea that a student on your caseload keeps getting pulled out for an informal removal, that's problematic too. So communication is key.
Yeah. And
All right.
IDA doesn't really specify how to count like partial day removals. So just think about best practice in this way. Like the most defensible thing would be to add them up, like 2 half days equals 1 full day, right? Just like the amount of hours that the student is removed from instruction, or removed from their placement, then just kind of like add those up together so that and then it would equal 10-day limit for the disciplinary removals. Yeah.
All right, next question. How can we apply standard disciplinary procedures to a student with a disability without violating IDEA?
Well, they're not exempt from school expectations or disciplinary procedures, right? But it does require, IDA requires schools to consider the student's disability and the circumstances around the behavior, and whether the school has provided the services in their IEP, right? So the more significant or exclusionary the disciplinary response becomes, the more important those protections are, right? So, it it's tricky because when you and depending on the student, it really is like very student dependent too, right? You might have a student that has a lot of challenging behavior, but may not have, the intellectual ability to have full understanding of delayed consequences, or so we look at discipline as a way to be responsive to a student's behavior, right? And we are making a lot of assumptions in those disciplinary decisions. With students that have an IEP, right? There's a disability there. What is that disability? How is it affecting them? And what makes the most sense for them to be able to um, make have that increased educational impact, right? So what are we doing that we can teach the student, and then how to get their needs met, right? Like that's where we kind of beat that horse today. Just like, behavior is communication, and it's a way for the student to get their need met, right? And they keep doing it because it's working for them. So by establishing those patterns, by looking at what might be happening, what is the school doing to prevent it, what supports are appropriate and being implemented, and what response will reduce the likelihood of this happening again is probably where we need to plant our thinking. And when we're talking about disability with students or talking about discipline with students with disabilities.
All right, we have 3 minutes left. If you don't want to hear the answer to the last question, I think there's only one left. I could be wrong. And you leave, you will not get marked absent. You'll get full credit for being here today. Just make sure your name's correct in the attendance thing so we know to give you credit. But oh, nope, there's more questions than, we've got a couple more questions. What do we do when we've done an FBA and a BIP, but behavior isn't improving?
What's your data telling you?
Yeah, I think that's the big piece is if you have a behavior intervention plan in place and the behavior is not improving, again, one of the big things first going back at looking at fidelity, are we implementing the plan as intended and are we doing it consistently? Is the replacement behavior that the team identified, is it really still meeting the same need as the problem behavior? So remember our kind of that short-term immediate support is to explicitly teach the student a more socially appropriate way to meet the same need. And it has to be explicitly taught, just like you would teach any other goal on the IEP. We have to explicitly teach the student what they can do instead. It has to work for them every single time across every single individual within the building. And so oftentimes that's a space where there's difficulty. Either it hasn't been explicitly taught, or maybe the replacement behavior isn't truly equivalent with the problem behavior as far as meeting the need. And so I would start there. But if the behavior isn't improving, then something about your plan isn't the best fit to best support the student, right? And so we need to look at all of those components and looking at your fidelity and ensuring that, we're explicitly teaching the student a way that replacement behavior and that it's being honored.
Yeah, and a good place to start too is just defining what success is for that student, right? Like kind of having a plan around that progress, right? Like if in the BIP form, it talks about, you know, what does it look like when this goal is met? And then if we've gotten, we're 5 weeks into this intervention and we've only made 2% increase, like is 2% for that student appropriate, right? Like is that what's the word, Stephanie, when you have a measurable goals?
A SMART goal?
No, you've got do we have a quick
Ambitious,
Or
reasonable.
ambitious
ambitious?
and
Is it ambitious enough
measurable?
for for that student, is 2% ambitious enough, right? Like, is that what we expect for this student? Or do we need to see more like 20%, right? Like, what do we need to do in order to get them going more, right? So defining what success is for that student, and then around like um, what that looks like, and then kind of talking about when do we come back as a team to make those changes to the plan if we're not, if seeing it be progress being stagnant or even going in the opposite direction, right? What do we do? Having a plan for the staff to be able to come back and look at that.
And for me, it's the same thing as, let's say you've done an assessment and you've realized that a student is low academically, and you're going to provide an intervention, and the skill, let's say they're working on math problem solving, it's not improving. What's the team going to do, right? It's the same sort of thing. The team's going to look at, okay, what are we doing it with fidelity, the intervention? Is something else going on? Are we targeting the actual need with that intervention, and just looking at problem solving and trying to figure out what is going on and what can adults do differently, or what needs to change in the environment, all of those sorts of things. All right. When is it appropriate to move forward with an FBA or behavior intervention plan versus trying additional general supports?
I think I'll just point them back to that challenging behavior flow chart. When you're looking at a team, asking you those questions, right? Does it have an educational impact, social emotional ability to relationships with their peers, and is it safe or harmful? And then kind of going through that flow chart, like, have we met these needs for the student in their environment? Can we go back and shore those things up? If the team decides that we've done a really good job at, like shoring up those environmental factors, then we go ahead with that FBA.
And again, sometimes there are exceptions. If you have a student that's engaging in behavior that is significantly harmful to themselves or others, sometimes we fast track, right? But this is kind of a nice general guide to support that, because we want to, if it's needed, we want to move forward with the process, but we also don't want to walk through this more resource and time intensive process if we can effectively support the student with some other less resource heavy strategies, like increasing predictability, supporting motivation, and ensuring that they have access to appropriate instruction.
That was the last question. Are there any other questions? I'm going to stop recording in just a second. I'm going to go to this module 3. There's 2 assignment options. Get them done by the 12th. Module 4 will open up by tomorrow. Just make sure you review the module before class on Wednesday, the 15th. We're going to be focusing on services, SDI, specially designed and instructional practices for students with disabilities. I'm now going to stop recording.